Arthur Vance was a man of absolute precision. In the small town of Oakhaven, people didn't set their watches by the radio. They set them by Arthur. Every morning at 7:30 a.m., he stepped off his porch in a pressed charcoal suit. At 5:15 p.m., he boarded the express train from the city. At 5:45 p.m., his silhouette would appear at the end of his driveway. He was a man of few words and zero surprises. He worked as a senior auditor for a firm that dealt with historical discrepancies, old bank ledgers, and forgotten accounts. His wife, Sarah, used to joke that Arthur was so predictable. Even the stray cats knew when to move off his sidewalk. But on November 12, 1998, the precision broke. It was a Tuesday. A cold, relentless rain was washing the color out of the suburbs. Sarah had prepared a pot roast, Arthur's favorite Tuesday meal. 5:45 p.m. came and went. The driveway remained empty. At 6 p.m., she stepped onto the porch, squinting into the gray sheets of rain. No Arthur. She called his office. He left at 5 p.m. sharp as always, his secretary said. Sarah called the station. The 5:15 p.m. express had arrived on time. There had been no accidents, no delays. By 9 p.m., the police were involved. Detective Elias Thorne, a man with a tired face and a sharp mind, took the lead. He went straight to the train station. Thorne reviewed the security tapes. The footage was grainy, but Arthur was unmistakable. He was seen walking onto the platform, holding a brown leather briefcase and a folded newspaper. He boarded carriage 4. Thorne then interviewed 3 regular commuters who sat in that same carriage. They all said the same thing. Arthur was there. He sat in his usual window seat. He opened his newspaper. But then a strange detail emerged. The lights flickered, one witness said. We were passing through the old tunnel under Blackwood Hill. It only lasted 3 seconds. When the lights came back on, the seat next to me was empty. I thought he'd just gone to the restroom. But Arthur hadn't gone to the restroom. When the train reached Oakhaven, the conductor checked carriage 4. Arthur's seat was indeed empty. On the seat sat his folded newspaper. On the floor sat his brown leather briefcase. But Arthur Vance had vanished from a moving, locked express train. Detective Thorne opened the briefcase. He expected to find tax audits or bank statements. Instead, he found something that made his skin crawl. The briefcase was filled with hundreds of Polaroids. They weren't photos of people. They were photos of Arthur's own house, taken from the woods behind his backyard. There were photos of Sarah sleeping. There were photos of Arthur himself, taken through the frosted glass of his office window. But the most disturbing part? The dates on the back of the photos. Some were dated 1978. Some were dated 1985. But Arthur and Sarah had only moved to Oakhaven in 1992. Thorne realized he wasn't looking for a missing person. He was looking for a man who had been living a lie for decades. Thorne went back to Sarah. He showed her the photos. She went pale, but she didn't look surprised. She led Thorne to the basement, to a small crawl space behind the water heater. Inside was a metal box. Arthur told me never to open this, she whispered. He said it was his insurance policy. Inside the box was a birth certificate and a passport for a man named David Miller. The photo on the passport was Arthur, but it was dated 20 years ago. Beneath the passport was a newspaper clipping from a different city, dated 1978. The headline read, Accountant David Miller vanishes from commuter train. Wife suspected. Thorne called the precinct from that city. The detective who handled the 1978 case was still alive. When Thorne explained the situation, the old detective gasped. That's impossible, the old man said. We found David Miller's body in the woods 2 weeks after he vanished in '78. I saw him with my own eyes. He was buried in St. Jude Cemetery. Thorne went back to the only place that made sense, the Blackwood Tunnel. He took a team of officers and searched every inch of the tracks inside that dark, dripping stone archway. Halfway through the tunnel, they found a maintenance door. It was rusted shut, but the scratches on the handle were fresh. They kicked the door open. Inside was a small room meant for track workers. It was filled with monitors. These monitors weren't hooked up to cameras. They were playing loops of Arthur's life. Arthur eating breakfast. Arthur walking to the train. Arthur sleeping. In the corner of the room, sitting in a wooden chair, was a man. He was wearing a charcoal suit. He was holding a brown leather briefcase. He looked exactly like Arthur, but he was older, much older. His hair was snow white, and his skin was like parchment. "You're late," the man said. His voice sounded like grinding stones. The man explained that he was the real Arthur Vance. In 1978, he had discovered a glitch in the Blackwood Tunnel, a moment where time didn't move forward, but folded over itself. He had tried to escape his life, his debts, and his failures by stepping through that fold. But the fold required a balance. If one Arthur left, another had to take his place. The man Sarah had been living with for the last 6 years wasn't an imposter. He was a replacement, a version of Arthur from a different point in the loop. The Arthur who vanished from the train that night hadn't been kidnapped. His time was simply up. He had been pulled back into the fold to make room for the next one. "Where is he now?" Thorne asked, his hand on his service pistol. The old man pointed to the monitor. On the screen, the 5:15 p.m. express was pulling into the station. A man in a charcoal suit stepped off the train. He adjusted his tie. He began walking toward the driveway. "He's going home to Sarah," the old man whispered. "He always goes home to Sarah." Thorne rushed back to the Vance house. He pulled into the driveway just as the figure in the charcoal suit reached the front door. "Arthur!" Thorne yelled. The man turned. It was Arthur. He looked young, refreshed, and completely confused. "Can I help you, detective?" Thorne looked past him into the house. Sarah was standing in the hallway, her face filled with a mixture of terror and relief. She looked at the man at the door, then at Thorne. She didn't say a word. She simply reached out and closed the door, locking it from the inside. Detective Thorne went back to the tunnel the next day, but the maintenance door was gone. Not just locked, the stone wall was solid, as if the door had never existed. He went to St. Jude's Cemetery and exhumed the body of David Miller from 1978. When they opened the casket, it was empty, except for a folded newspaper and a brown leather briefcase. Arthur Vance continued to live in Oakhaven for another 6 years. He was perfectly predictable. He was never late. He never missed a Tuesday pot roast. And then, on November 12, 2004, the lights flickered in the Blackwood Tunnel once again. Arthur Vance never came home that night. And at the end of the driveway, a new silhouette was already waiting to take his place. Thorne went back to Sarah. The sun over Varna Airport was relentless. It was July 8, 2014, a Tuesday morning in Bulgaria, and the tarmac shimmered with a dry, suffocating heat. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere was sterile, the usual hum of rolling suitcases and muffled gate announcements. Nothing about the scene suggested that, in mere moments, a 28-year-old German man would become a ghost. Lars Mittank was not a man prone to shadows. Tall, athletic, and well-liked, he had come to the Golden Sands Resort with friends for a week of sun and football. But the vacation had taken a jagged turn. A physical altercation with some rival fans over a football disagreement had left Lars with a ruptured eardrum. His friends had flown home days earlier, but the doctor's orders were clear. The pressure of a flight could shatter his inner ear. Lars had to stay behind. For the last 24 hours, the man his family knew had begun to dissolve. Before arriving at the airport, Lars had spent a terrifying night at the Hotel Color, a budget lodging in a gritty part of Varna. He had called his mother, Sandra, in the middle of the night, his voice a frantic whisper that didn't sound like his own. "They won't let me leave," he hissed into the receiver. "For men are following me." What is cefuroxime 500? He was referring to the antibiotic prescribed for his ear, but in his mind, the pills had become a catalyst for a conspiracy. He spent the night pacing the hallways, hiding in the elevator, and peering through the curtains at a world he was convinced was closing in on him. By the time the sun rose, Lars seemed to have regained a fragile grip on reality. He took a taxi to the airport, hoping to finally fly home to Germany. At 9 a.m., Lars entered the office of Dr. Kostakostov, the airport physician. He needed a final signature to be cleared for flight. To the casual observer, Lars looked like any other tourist, wearing a bright yellow t-shirt, blue shorts, and carrying a heavy hiking backpack. Dr. Kostov later recalled that Lars seemed restless and nervous, but coherent. They talked for several minutes about his ear and the medication. Then, the mundane turned macabre. A construction worker, dressed in the high-visibility vest of the airport maintenance crew, entered the room to perform a routine check. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at Lars. But the sight of the man in uniform acted like a tripwire in Lars's brain. Lars stood up abruptly. His eyes widened, darting toward the door. The color drained from his face until his skin matched the white tile of the clinic. "I don't want to die here," Lars whispered. "I have to get out of here." "Lars, wait," Dr. Kostov started, but it was too late. What happened next is captured on the grainy, silent footage of Varna Airport's CCTV, video that has since been viewed millions of times by amateur sleuths and private investigators. Lars Mittank bolted from the doctor's office. He left everything behind: his wallet containing hundreds of euros, his passport, and his mobile phone. He didn't just walk. He ran with the desperate, lung-bursting speed of a man fleeing a predator. He burst through the terminal doors and into the bright, midday sun. The broad daylight was his only witness. He sprinted across the parking lot, weaving between taxis and buses. He didn't look back. There was no one chasing him on the footage, only the invisible terrors of his own mind. He reached the perimeter of the airport, a massive 8-foot-tall barbed wire fence. To an ordinary person, it was an impassable barrier. To Lars, it was the finish line. In one fluid, adrenaline-fueled motion, he scaled the fence, his yellow shirt snagging momentarily on the wire before he dropped down on the other side. Beyond the fence lay the Aksakovo region, a dense, sprawling meadow of sunflowers and thick forest. Lars Mittank stepped into the tall weeds. The yellow of his shirt blended with the yellow of the sunflowers. And then he was gone. The search began almost immediately, but it was as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. The Bulgarian police, aided by German investigators and thermal imaging drones, combed every square inch of the forest. They found nothing. No torn fabric from his yellow shirt, no footprints in the dirt, no remains. How does a man vanish in an open field in the middle of the day, with no resources and an agonizing ear injury? The theories began to swirl like a dark fog. Some suggested a drug-induced psychosis, a rare side effect of the antibiotic cefuroxime. Others whispered about the Bulgarian organ mafia, suggesting Lars had been targeted for his healthy physique. His mother, heartbroken and relentless, hired a private investigator who spent years tracking leads across Europe, but every trail ended in a cul-de-sac. The most terrifying aspect of the Lars Mittank case isn't the possibility of a crime. It's the lack of one. The footage of Lars running remains one of the most unsettling things on the internet. It is the visual record of a man losing his soul to fear. In the video, he doesn't look like a criminal or a victim. He looks like a man who has seen something no one else can see. For over a decade, sightings have been reported. A truck driver in Brazil claimed to have seen a man matching Lars's description walking aimlessly along a highway. A homeless man in Dusseldorf was photographed looking remarkably like an aged Lars. Each lead was a spark of hope that was quickly extinguished by DNA tests or lack of evidence. If you go to Varna today, the airport looks much the same. The sun still beats down on the sunflowers in the fields beyond the fence. Travelers still rush to their gates, complaining about delays or lost luggage. But for the family of Lars Mittank, time stopped on that Tuesday in 2014. To them, the bright, sunny weather is a mockery. We are taught to fear the dark, the alleyways at midnight, the shadows in the corner of the room. We feel safe in the light. Lars Mittank proved that the light offers no protection. You can be surrounded by people under the gaze of a dozen cameras in the peak of the afternoon heat and still be erased. He didn't leave a note. He didn't leave a body. He left only a yellow blur on a security tape, a permanent reminder that sometimes the things we are running from aren't behind us. They are inside us. To this day, Lars Mittank is officially listed as a missing person. His mother still maintains a Facebook page dedicated to finding him, posting photos of what he might look like today. Older, perhaps bearded, perhaps scarred. The sunflowers in Varna bloom and die every year. They stand tall, soaking up the Bulgarian sun, masking whatever secrets lie in the soil beneath them. Somewhere in those woods, or perhaps thousands of miles away under a different name, is the answer. Until then, Lars Mittank remains the man who ran into the daylight and never came out.
The Mary Celeste, the Ghost Ship Mystery. December 5, 1872. In the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, a ship named Dei Grazia sailed through the fog near the Azores Islands. The crew noticed something strange on the horizon. Another ship. It was drifting slowly, almost silently. Its sails were open, but something felt wrong. No one stood on the deck. No sailors adjusted the ropes. No captain steered the wheel. Just an empty ship moving across the ocean. The name written on the side of the vessel was Mary Celeste. And what the sailors discovered on that ship would become one of the most terrifying maritime mysteries in history. The story of the Mary Celeste began almost a month earlier. On November 7, 1872, the ship left New York Harbor on a routine trading voyage. The captain of the ship was Benjamin Spooner Briggs, an experienced and respected sailor. Briggs was known for his calm personality and strong leadership. This voyage was special for another reason. For the first time, Captain Briggs brought his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia along with him. The rest of the crew consisted of 7 skilled sailors, all experienced at sea. Their destination was Genoa, Italy. The ship carried a cargo of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. Everything about the voyage seemed completely normal. The ship was in excellent condition. The weather was good, and the crew was experienced. No one could imagine that within a few weeks, every single person aboard would disappear. On December 5th, the Dei Grazia spotted the Mary Celeste drifting in the ocean. At first, the captain thought the ship might be having trouble. But as they watched more closely, something became clear. The ship was sailing strangely. It moved with the wind but seemed out of control. Captain David Morehouse decided to investigate. He ordered several crew members to board the mysterious vessel. As their small boat approached the Mary Celeste, a strange silence filled the air. The ship looked perfectly normal, but there was no sign of life. When the sailors climbed onto the deck, they realized something was terribly wrong. The ship was completely abandoned. The boarding crew searched the entire ship. Cabins, storage rooms, decks, the captain's quarters. But there was no one there. The crew had vanished. But the strangest part was that the ship itself was still in good condition. The cargo was untouched. Food supplies were still stored in the kitchen. Fresh water was still available. Personal belongings were still inside the cabins. Even the captain's documents and valuables were left behind. Nothing suggested a violent attack. There were no signs of struggle. No blood. No broken furniture. The only thing missing was the lifeboat. It appeared that the crew had left the ship using the small emergency boat. But why? The Mary Celeste was still perfectly capable of sailing. There was no clear reason to abandon it. Investigators then examined the ship's logbook. This book recorded important events during the voyage. The final entry was written 10 days earlier. The ship had been sailing normally near the Azores. After that, nothing. No explanation. No warning. Just silence. Whatever happened on the Mary Celeste happened suddenly, and the crew never had the chance to record it. Over the years, investigators have proposed many theories. Some believed the cargo of industrial alcohol created dangerous fumes. Perhaps the crew feared a massive explosion. If they smelled the fumes or heard a loud blast, they might have panicked and temporarily abandoned the ship. But if the lifeboat drifted away or the rope connecting it broke, the crew would have been left stranded in the ocean. Another theory suggests a rogue wave or violent waterspout frightened the crew. The ocean can be unpredictable. Even experienced sailors sometimes make desperate decisions. Others believed pirates attacked the ship. But this theory quickly fell apart. Nothing had been stolen. The cargo remained untouched. Valuable items were still inside the cabins. Some people even suggested mutiny or crime. But Captain Briggs was respected by his crew. And again, there was no evidence of violence, because no theory fully explained the mystery. The legend of the Mary Celeste only grew darker. News of the mysterious ship spread across the world. Newspapers called it the greatest maritime mystery. People began to imagine darker explanations. Some believed the ship was cursed. Others believed supernatural forces were responsible. Stories of ghost ships had always existed among sailors. But the Mary Celeste felt different, because this mystery was real. A ship discovered in the middle of the ocean, perfectly intact, yet completely empty. More than 150 years later, the truth is still unknown. No bodies were ever discovered. No survivor ever appeared. No final message explained what happened. Captain Briggs, his wife, their small daughter, and 7 sailors simply vanished from history. The Mary Celeste continued drifting alone across the Atlantic, the silent ship, carrying one of the ocean's greatest mysteries. And perhaps somewhere beneath those dark waters, the ocean still hides the answer. #The shadow over the grove, the Hinterkaifeck mystery. 600 meters from the small Bavarian village of Grobern sat a lonely farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. In the spring of 1922, this wasn't just a place of labor, it was a place of deep, suffocating secrets. The farm was a Einadhof, a secluded homestead, hidden behind a thicket of trees known as the Koppenwall Wood. For the residents of Grobern, Hinterkaifeck was a dark spot on the map. It was a place people avoided after sunset. By April 4, 1922, the farm would become more than just a local curiosity. It would become the site of a crime so inexplicable, so brutal, and so psychologically disturbing that it remains the most famous cold case in German history. This is the story of 6 lives ended by a phantom, and a killer who didn't just strike and flee, but moved in to live with the dead. To understand the horror, we have to understand the family. The Grubers were not beloved. The patriarch, 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, was a man described by neighbors as morose, stingy, and aggressive. He was a loner who lived for his land and little else. His wife, Kazilia, 72, was a woman who seemed hollowed out by years of hard labor and a marriage that many rumored to be abusive. Then there was their daughter, Victoria Gabriel. At 35, Victoria was a widow. Her husband, Karl, had reportedly been killed in the trenches of World War I in 1914. Victoria was the family's only bridge to the village, possessing a beautiful soprano voice that she lent to the church choir. But even her grace was tainted by scandal. The village was rife with rumors that Andreas and Victoria shared an incestuous relationship, a claim bolstered by the fact that Andreas had served time in prison for incestuous indecency years prior. Finally, there were the children, 7-year-old Kazilia, a quiet girl, and 2-year-old Joseph. The paternity of little Joseph was a source of constant vitriol in the town. Some said he was the son of a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Others whispered that he was the product of the dark secret between Andreas and his daughter. This was the powder keg of Hinterkaifeck, a family isolated by geography, by social shunning, and by their own internal demons. The mystery of the murders doesn't begin on the night of the crime, but 6 months earlier. In late 1921, the family's previous maid suddenly packed her bags and left. She didn't leave because of the low pay or the grueling work. She left because she was convinced the farm was haunted. She told the villagers she heard footsteps in the attic when the house was empty. She felt eyes on her in the barn. She spoke of a presence that made the very air feel cold. Andreas, a man of cold logic and sharp edges, dismissed her as a hysterical woman. But by March 1922, even the hardened Andreas couldn't ignore the reality that something was closing in on them. In the days leading up to the massacre, a series of glitches occurred in the daily life of the farm. 1. The newspaper Andreas found a Munich newspaper on the porch. No one in the house had bought it and the postman hadn't delivered it. It was a paper from a distant city, left like a calling card. 2. The footprints after a light dusting of snow, Andreas discovered a trail of footprints leading from the woods straight to the machine shed. He followed them, expecting to find a thief. But the tracks stopped at the door and to his horror there were no return tracks. Someone had entered the farm but they had never left. 3. The keys the family's set of house keys vanished. Andreas searched everywhere, growing increasingly paranoid, but they were never found. 4. The scratches he discovered deep, fresh scratches on the lock of the tool shed, as if someone had tried to force it open with a crude tool. On the night of March 30th, Andreas told his neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer about these events. Lorenz offered him a firearm for protection. Andreas, in his typical stubborn fashion, refused. He believed he could handle whatever was hiding in his woods. He was wrong. On Friday, March 31, 1922, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm. Maria was 44 years old, and her arrival was a somber affair. She had been reluctant to take the job because of the farm's reputation, but she needed the work. Her sister dropped her off that afternoon, helped her carry her bags to the small maid's quarters and said goodbye. Maria had been on the property for less than 6 hours when the sun went down. She was still unpacking her few belongings when the ghost Andreas had feared finally emerged from the shadows. We can only reconstruct the events of that Friday night through the forensic lens of the Munich police. It began in the barn. Historians believe that one by one the family members were lured out of the house. Perhaps the killer made a noise in the stable, or perhaps a cow had been untethered. Andreas was the first to investigate. As he stepped into the darkness of the barn, he was met not by a thief, but by a shadow holding a roothaw, a heavy cross-shaped mattock used for clearing roots and tilling soil. The blow was vertical and devastating. Andreas was struck in the temple, his skull shattered. Next came the women. It is believed that Kazilia and Victoria went to look for Andreas when he didn't return. They walked into a kill zone. The attacker was efficient and possessed terrifying strength. The elderly Kazilia was struck several times. Forensic reports later showed she had been strangled as well. Victoria suffered 9 separate blows to the head. The most heart-wrenching victim was the 7-year-old little Kazilia. She was lured into the barn to find her mother and grandparents, only to witness the carnage. She was struck down but she did not die instantly. The autopsy later revealed that she survived for several hours in the hay, surrounded by the bodies of her family. In her state of shock and agony, she had torn out clumps of her own hair. With the 4 adults and the eldest child dead or dying in the barn, the killer turned his attention to the house. He walked through the kitchen and into the maid's room. Maria Baumgartner, the woman who had arrived only hours before, never had a chance. She was killed where she stood. Finally, the killer entered the nursery. He approached the bassinet of 2-year-old Joseph. With a coldness that defies human understanding, he swung the mattock into the crib. The family was gone. This is the point where the Hinterkaifeck story shifts from a murder mystery to a psychological nightmare. In most crimes, the perpetrator flees the scene immediately. But for the next 4 days, from Friday night until Tuesday afternoon, the killer stayed at the farm. In most crimes, the perpetrator flees the scene immediately. But for the next 4 days, from Friday night until Tuesday afternoon, the killer stayed at the farm. Imagine the scene. 6 corpses lay cooling in the barn in the house, and in the kitchen the killer was frying eggs. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney all through the weekend. The cattle were not left to starve. Someone fed them. Someone milked the cows. Someone even tied up the family dog, which had been barking, and provided it with food. On Saturday, when young Kazilia didn't show up for school, the village didn't panic. It was a farm and children were often kept home for chores. On Sunday, when the family missed church, people noticed, but the Grubers were reclusive anyway. During these 4 days, the killer was a ghost in the machine. He slept in their beds. He ate their food. He sat in the silence of the Bavarian woods, surrounded by the literal fruits of his slaughter. What? Was he looking for something? Was he savoring his victory? Or was he simply a man with nowhere else to go? The silence finally broke on Tuesday, April 4th. A repairman named Michael Pohl had been scheduled to fix a stationary engine on the farm. He arrived and knocked, but no one answered. He stayed for nearly 5 hours, completing his work in the yard and the barn. He noted the eerie silence, the locked doors, and the fact that the dog was tied up and barking hoarsely. When Pohl returned to the village and mentioned the strange atmosphere, a search party was finally formed. Lorenz Schlittenbauer and 2 other men walked the 600 meters to the farmstead. They entered the barn first. They began moving piles of hay and stumbled upon a door that had been laid flat on the ground. When they lifted it, the horror was revealed. A stack of bodies, Andreas, the 2 Kazilias and Victoria, all matted with blood and hay. Schlittenbauer, in a move that would later make him a prime suspect, didn't wait for the police. He broke into the house, screaming for his son Joseph. He found the maid in her room and the toddler in his crib. The village of Grobern was shattered. The police from Munich were called, but by the time they arrived, the scene had been trampled by dozens of curious onlookers. The investigation was a disaster from the start, but nothing could prepare the detectives for the autopsies. They discovered that the heads of the victims were missing, sent to Munich for study by psychic investigators, and that the weapon was a tool Andreas himself had owned. The killer hadn't brought a weapon. He had used the family's own tools to end them. When the Munich police, the Mord Commission, arrived at Hinterkaifeck on April 5, 1922, they stepped into a crime scene that looked like a fever dream. The air was thick with the smell of livestock and decay. Because the killer had lived in the house for days after the murders, the freshness of the evidence was gone. The lead investigator, George Reingruber, was a seasoned detective, but even he was baffled. The first thing that struck him was the organization of the bodies. In the barn, the 4 victims had been stacked neatly and covered with hay and an old door. In the house, Maria Baumgartner's body was covered with a bedsheet, and little Joseph's crib was covered with one of his mother's dresses. This wasn't a hit-and-run robbery. This was a personal, methodical clearing of a household. The forensics of 1922 were primitive, but the results were chilling. The court physician, Dr. Johann Baptist Aumler, performed the autopsies on a makeshift table in the farmyard. He determined that the weapon was a Ruthau, a pickaxe-like tool. The precision of the strike suggested a killer who was either incredibly strong or very familiar with the tool. But the most disturbing discovery was the fate of young Kazilia. The medical report suggested she had remained alive for 2 to 3 hours after being struck, lying in the dark barn next to the corpses of her mother and grandparents, literally tearing her own hair out in a state of terminal shock. In a bizarre twist that sounds like something out of a horror movie, the victims' heads were removed and sent to Munich. The police were so desperate that they gave the skulls to clairvoyants and psychic detectives, hoping they could see the killer's face in the bone. The skulls were later lost during the chaos of World War II, meaning the victims were eventually buried in a local cemetery without their heads. The first name on everyone's lips was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Lorenz was a local farmer who had been romantically involved with Victoria Gabriel after her husband died. He was the presumed father of little Joseph, though he had avoided paying child support. The case against him was circumstantial but heavy. The behavior at the scene, when the search party arrived, Lorenz was the first to break into the house. While the other men were paralyzed with fear, Lorenz reportedly walked through the dark rooms with ease. The key: remember the missing house keys from part 1. Some believed Lorenz had them. The motive: he had a volatile relationship with Andreas Gruber, who had once accused him of incestuous behavior with Victoria. The disturbed evidence: after finding the bodies, Lorenz began moving them before the police arrived. Was he looking for something? Or was he arranging the scene? Despite being questioned repeatedly, Lorenz was never charged. He spent the rest of his life filing defamation lawsuits against neighbors who called him a murderer, eventually dying in 1941, still under a cloud of suspicion. The most cinematic theory in the Hinterkaifeck mystery is the return of the dead husband. Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, had reportedly been killed by a shell in the trenches of France in 1914. His body was never recovered. In the aftermath of the murders, several soldiers from Carl's regiment came forward with a terrifying claim. They whispered that Carl hadn't died, he had been captured or he had deserted, and had spent years in a Russian POW camp. The theory suggests that Carl returned to Bavaria only to find his wife had given birth to another man's child, Joseph, and was living in a house of sin with her father. Driven by a vengeful rage, the dead soldier used his military training to infiltrate the farm, live in the attic, and systematically execute the family that had replaced him. While most historians dismiss this, some villagers swore they saw a man in a tattered military uniform lurking in the woods in the days before the massacre. Because the 1920s were a time of great economic upheaval in Germany, many wandering laborers moved through the countryside. The police investigated over 100 suspects. Two brothers, Anton and Karl Thurnbach, were heavily scrutinized. Anton had allegedly made a comment to a co-worker months prior, saying that the Gruber family should be killed. However, no physical evidence ever linked them to the farm. Others believed it was a botched robbery. Andreas Gruber was known to keep large sums of cash on the property. However, when the police searched the house, they found thousands of marks in cash and expensive jewelry left untouched. The killer hadn't come for money. He had come for blood. Why couldn't the finest detectives in Munich solve this? The contamination. By the time the police arrived, the farm had been cleaned by the killer and then trampled by the village. The attic. When investigators finally climbed into the attic, they found the floor covered in hay to muffle footsteps. They also found 2 indentations in the hay where someone had been sleeping, and roof tiles that had been shifted so the ghost could watch the yard. The killer had been living right above their heads for days, maybe weeks. The silence of the village, the people of Grobern and Kafek were tight-lipped. They knew the Gruber's secrets, but they didn't like the police. Many details were likely taken to the grave by neighbors who knew more than they let on. In 1923, a year after the murders, the farmstead of Hinterkaifeck was completely demolished. The neighbors couldn't stand the sight of it anymore. As the workers tore down the walls, they found the final piece of the puzzle, the Ruthaw, the murder weapon, hidden in the attic floorboards. It had been there the whole time, tucked away by the killer before he finally decided to leave his new home. Today, nothing remains of the farm but a small stone memorial in the middle of an open field. The woods have encroached on the land and the Koppenwall still stands dark and silent. The Hinterkaifeck murders endure because they tap into our deepest fears. It's not just the violence, it's the intrusion. It's the idea that while you are eating dinner, someone is in your attic. While you are sleeping, someone is watching you through a gap in the ceiling. While you think you are alone in your isolated home, you are actually sharing it with your executioner. In 2007, students at the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy used modern criminalistic techniques to re-examine the case. They reached a conclusion on who the killer was, but out of respect for the descendants of the suspects who are still alive, they refused to name him publicly. The name of the man who held the pickaxe remains a secret, buried in the dark soil of Bavaria. Hinterkaifeck is no longer a farm. It is a ghost story that reminds us that sometimes, the footprints in the snow only lead one way.
The Dyatlov Pass Incident. The wind howled like a living thing across the frozen slopes of the Ural Mountains. It wasn't just cold, it was a kind of cold that crept into the bones, a cold that silenced thoughts and numbed the will to survive. In the winter of 1959, 9 experienced hikers set out on an expedition into this unforgiving wilderness. They were young, strong, and trained to endure the harshest conditions nature could throw at them. They had maps, equipment, and confidence. What they didn't have was any idea that they were walking toward one of the most mysterious tragedies in human history. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student known for his intelligence, discipline, and leadership. His team consisted of fellow students and graduates, each one skilled in skiing, survival, and mountaineering. This was not a reckless adventure. It was a carefully planned journey, a test of endurance meant to earn them top-level certification in trekking. Their destination was a remote mountain in the northern Urals, a place known to the local Monsey people as Kolet Syakhl, Dead Mountain. The name should have been a warning. The expedition began smoothly. Spirits were high. The group joked, sang, and documented their journey with photographs and diary entries. Snow covered the landscape like an endless white ocean, broken only by dark lines of trees and jagged ridges. The hikers moved steadily, pulling their gear on sleds, carving paths through deep drifts. Each night, they set up camp, cooked simple meals, and rested in their shared tent, a long canvas structure designed to hold all 9 of them. But as they pushed deeper into the mountains, conditions worsened. The wind grew stronger, the temperature dropped further, and visibility became unpredictable. On January 31st, they reached the edge of a highland area leading toward their final ascent. It was here that things began to shift, subtly at first, almost unnoticed. The next day, February 1st, they attempted to cross the mountain slope. But poor weather and strong winds forced them off course. Instead of descending into a safer, forested valley, they made a decision that would prove fatal. They set up camp on the exposed slope of Curated itself. It was a strange choice. Experienced hikers usually avoid camping on open slopes, especially in extreme weather. The forest below offered shelter from the wind, firewood, and better protection. Yet for reasons still debated, they chose to stay where they were. Perhaps they didn't want to lose altitude. Perhaps they believed they could manage. Or perhaps, something else influenced that decision. They pitched their tent on the incline, anchoring it into the snow. Inside, they laid out their gear, removed their outer layers, and prepared for the night. The wind outside screamed across the mountain. The darkness closed in. And then, something happened. No one knows exactly what it was. But sometime during the night, all 9 hikers suddenly fled their tent. Not through the entrance, but by cutting their way out from the inside. The canvas was slashed open. From within. It was not a careful exit. It was a desperate escape. They left behind their boots, their coats, their supplies. They ran into the freezing night, barefoot, half-dressed, into temperatures that could kill within minutes. Why? What could have terrified them so completely that they would abandon safety and run into certain death? Days turned into weeks before a search party was organized. When the hikers failed to return on schedule, concern began to grow. Eventually, rescuers set out to retrace their path. What they found would only deepen the mystery. The tent was discovered first. It was partially buried in snow, still standing, but damaged. The investigators noted that it had been cut open from the inside. Inside, everything was left behind as if the occupants had vanished in an instant. Shoes were neatly placed. Clothes remained folded. Food and personal belongings were untouched. It didn't look like a normal evacuation. It looked like panic. Following the trail away from the tent, the searchers found footprints in the snow. Bare feet. Socks. A single boot here and there. The prints led downhill, toward the forest. But there was something strange about them. They weren't chaotic. They weren't the marks of people running for their lives. They were calm. Measured. As if the group had walked away, not fled. This contradiction would haunt the investigation. The first bodies were found near a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. 2 hikers lay there, barefoot, wearing only undergarments. Their skin was burned and torn, their hands injured as if they had tried to climb the tree. Nearby, remnants of a small fire suggested they had attempted to survive the cold. Between the tree and the tent, 3 more bodies were discovered. These individuals appeared to have been trying to return to the tent. Their positions, frozen mid-movement, told a silent story of desperation. They had turned back, perhaps realizing the danger, but they never made it. The remaining 4 hikers were not found until months later, buried under deep snow in a ravine further into the forest. Their condition was far more disturbing. These bodies showed severe internal injuries, crushed ribs, fractured skulls, yet there were no external wounds to match the force required. It was as if an immense pressure had been applied from within. One woman was missing her tongue. Others had missing eyes. Some clothing showed traces of radiation. It didn't make sense. The official investigation struggled to provide answers. There were no signs of a struggle. No evidence of an attack by another group. No indication of an avalanche large enough to explain the behavior. The injuries didn't match typical survival scenarios. In the end, the case was closed with a vague conclusion. The cause of death was an unknown compelling force. It was a phrase that explained nothing. And so, the theories began. Some believed it was an avalanche, that a sudden movement of snow had frightened the hikers, causing them to cut their way out and flee. But the slope angle was not steep enough for a typical avalanche. The tent was still partially intact. And the footprints remained visible, undisturbed. Others suggested infrasound, a phenomenon where wind passing over certain shapes can create low-frequency vibrations that affect the human mind. It could cause panic, anxiety, even hallucinations. Perhaps the hikers experienced an overwhelming sense of dread, forcing them to abandon their shelter. There were theories of secret military tests. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that experimental weapons had been tested in the area. Strange lights were reportedly seen in the sky around that time. Could the hikers have witnessed something they weren't supposed to see? And then there were the darker theories. Something unknown. Something not of this world. Something that moved silently through the snow, unseen but powerful. But there was never any proof. In 2020, Russian authorities reopened the case and concluded that an avalanche was the most likely explanation. A small slab of snow, they said, could have shifted under the tent, creating the impression of imminent danger. The hikers, fearing a larger collapse, cut their way out and retreated. Disoriented in the darkness and cold, they succumbed to hypothermia and injury. It was a logical explanation. But not everyone was convinced. Because even with this conclusion, the questions remain. Why didn't they return to the tent once the danger passed? Why were some injuries so severe? Why was there radiation? Why did they leave so calmly, yet die so violently? The Dyatlov Pass incident is more than a tragedy. It is a puzzle frozen in time. A moment where logic fails and mystery takes hold. 9 lives ended on that mountain. Their final moments are lost to the wind, buried beneath layers of snow and silence. And somewhere in the endless white of Kolat cycle, the truth still waits.